Well, hello, Sandy.
Amy, go Chiefs, go Chiefs, go Chiefs. Sorry, had to say it.
Oh, Chiefs. I have a shirt on today.
Yay! I cheer for I love it. I cheered for Kansas City before it was cool. That's what
Yes,
Amy's amazing t-shirt says.
I know I got this last week. I will tell you, I've been a fan since the mid 80s, and it has been a it's just been hard to be a fan because they just have struggled, and these last 5 years have just been beautiful. And it's like
Yay.
riding the wave because I know that it can go away just like that. But boy, we're having a good time right now.
And I have two sons that have their teams that have had like one is Panthers, success, struggle. The other's the Bears. But no matter
Uh,
what, they stick with their teams, right? And then I have a third that the other two will call the bandwagon one that just kind of, but you know what? You be you.
you be you,
I don't know.
exactly.
I'm not a bandwagon. I enjoy the sport, the game, the stories, and I'm not a good, I'm not the fangirl that yeah. I love when it comes to sports, I love the team typically that whoever I'm with is supporting
Yeah.
because I'm just
Same.
not that sporty.
Well, I love the success, but I also appreciate the struggles. So the teams, like this year, the Chiefs had a horrible season. I'm just going to say, up until the end, it
Mhm.
was really a lot of struggle. And I really appreciated that because, it's great when you win every single game, but when you can lose some and continue to keep fighting and thinking you're still in it and keep fighting, that's where I don't know. That's where I really respect people.
So, Amy, if you've ever seen, if I was wearing my t-shirt, and again, everybody, you be you, because I
Yeah.
applaud your knowledge of the sport. I mean, applaud it. Just like I got my things, like I
Totally.
could tell you every classical book, right? But if I had my t-shirt for sports, if you've ever seen that gif of the mom in the stands and it says, I just want everyone to have fun, that would be my t-shirt.
Well, that's true. I do like that, except for somebody at the end usually doesn't have fun. Doesn't,
Exactly.
yeah, unfortunately. Not everybody can walk away winner. All right, so today we are discussing Solomon's paradox. Had you ever heard of this when I
No,
sent it to you?
no.
I hadn't either. I received an email from somebody that I get weekly emails, I think, from. I think they're weekly. And his emails are always very insightful, and it kind of prompts a little you should think about this. This is something great to think about. And I'll pull up his name before we're done, but I can't just pull it off the top of my head right now. But anyway, the Solomon's paradox, the way it is explained is it's actually from the Bible, and it was King Solomon who was really good at giving advice and how you should live your life and the things. And so he was viewed as very wise, except for he never took his own advice. And one of the examples was, you should be married and honor your wife or something like that, and be loyal to this person, this one person. Yet he had many wives.
Wow.
And and then there were some other things. So anyway, the Solomon's paradox is about people who are really good at giving advice and don't take the advice. And I'm just going to say all of us that give advice and don't take our own advice, because I think almost everybody does it on some aspect or another.
I agree because isn't there, so it's easy to say, oh, wow, I can't believe he gave that advice and then he took all the wives. And we're pretty quick to point the finger when people do that.
Yeah.
And I'm guilty of that. But on the other side, I think part of giving advice is we're trying to tell ourselves what's right and what we should be doing. And none of us are perfect either. I mean, isn't part of advice giving what we believe in and what we think should happen? So aren't we kind of telling ourselves too?
Oh, totally. Yes. I think that's a really good point because a lot of times, well, sometimes we're speaking from experience. So I think about my kids when they're in a situation and they're asking for advice and I give them advice. Sometimes I'm just tapping into my experience and I'm not in that situation right now. And it's not like, dating advice, things like that. Um, but there are times that we're giving advice. And one of the things that they said was when you're giving advice, when you need advice and you're trying to figure something out,
Mhm.
start putting one of your friends or somebody in that situation. So put your child in that situation. And what advice would you give them? And what would you hope that they did in that situation? And that kind of helps you shift the way you think about it.
One thing that I find is, and I'll use the kids as an example, the adult children, is I'll think about something that seems pretty straightforward and I'm giving them advice and telling them, uh, don't procrastinate on this. You need to get at it, you need to get it done. And then one thing I'll do is I'll put myself in the space of where I was at when I was their age,
Yeah.
because we do have a lot of learnings and we can say this this, that, and the other. But sometimes when I go back, I remember I didn't do all these things. I procrastinated. I didn't send thank yous. That was one question I had had. I was kind of alarmed, not with them, but this kind of follows what you just got done saying too. I had done some really, I thought, thoughtful gift giving, and it was very personalized. And then I included, because I didn't want to leave, it was for new babies. I didn't want to leave other kids out. So I bought these books that I thought a lot of and sent them books, and I didn't get not one thank you, not one text. And I thought, how hard is it to send a text? I get it. So I was trying to think through in my mind, okay. And then I double checked and I found out that they did receive them. But then my next thought was, okay, I'm going to turn around and talk to my own kids and say, please tell me that if somebody sends you something, you know, I hope, I always wanted my kids to write handwritten notes, right? And thank yous. But I also know times have changed, right? Do they even keep stamps? Probably not. But I would hope they would send a text. As I was having the conversation with one of my sons who says, oh yeah, and he gave an example. He's like, and Kathy always Venmos us money. And I immediately send her a text and we have a nice conversation. I'm like, perfect. But then I remembered for my wedding back in the late 80s, I was busy working. I was typing or taking the CPA exam, and I was late in getting my thank yous out. And I got a letter from an aunt saying, did you get our gift of, I think at the $50, which was a lot. I never
Yeah.
heard anything from you. And I remember being pissed, thinking, I was going to get her a thank you. Of course, she knew I cashed the check. That was really kind of bitchy of her. And I remember in my mind thinking that that was kind of a bitchy thing to do. But here I was not sending a thank you. And now here I am doing Solomon's Paradox saying, woe is me. Nobody's acknowledging the gift, right? So I did the full circle. I wouldn't do that now, Amy. I would absolutely like go out of my way to, I acknowledge everything, but I sure didn't talk the talk back then.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that, though, is your phase in life and lessons learned. So you have learned, and I'm just going to tell you the perspective shift that children give you, because a lot of times when, I wasn't great at sending thank yous either, but when my kids received gifts, I was like, all right, you need to do this. And so I think that, because you want them to, well, I always wanted my kids to be better than me. I heard one of my friends, her mom said, I was talking to her mom, and I don't know if I've ever told you this. And I was saying, oh, I just love your daughter. And I started saying all these things I liked about her. And her mom said, she's a block off the old chip. And I remember thinking, wow, I want to be able to say that about my kids. Instead of them being the chip, I want them to be the block. I'd like me be the little part and them be bigger and better. So
I
anyway,
love that. Well, I just made a note because what you said, we always want our kids to be better than us. That's part of this whole paradox too. We might not be doing it, but we want, whether it be our kids, our spouse, a friend, is there a part of us that is hopeful because it's a struggle to be human, right? And to try to do everything right. Are we are we on a quest to have those that whom we love to be better than us, right?
right. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. One of the things that I've noticed a lot is that sometimes we can't see it from a distance. You know, we're so ingrained in what we're doing that we don't see the big picture of it because it's in our day to day. So when somebody points out the big picture of it, sometimes it doesn't resonate with us, or sometimes it's surprising to us. It's like, oh, I didn't even see that happening.
Mhm.
So we might be like, I have to like figure out if their advice is needed. Does that make sense?
That makes
Because
sense.
like it's so in your day to day. And it's like, oh, wait a minute. Sometimes it does shift your perspective, but sometimes you have to mull it over.
I find that I can be very dismissive and I don't notice it. And it will be Garrett who points out to me, you give them about 30 seconds on the phone. This is usually with my sons, and you're done, with a conversation. Have you ever tried letting them finish the conversation? And it was really eye-opening to me because I didn't realize I was being dismissive, that when, I had a point or I wanted to chat, when I was done, I was done. And it changed the whole feel of the conversation by me allowing it to be open-ended for them to choose when to end the conversation. But it was something I never would have picked up on if it wasn't brought to my attention.
Yeah. So how did it go? Like, did they know how to end the conversation, or did they feel uncomfortable being the one to do it?
It was all positive because it was a little weird at first. Like they're like, oh, she's not hanging up. She's not saying talk to you later, "Oh, love you, goodbye."
Yeah.
But then it was kind of, I don't, giddy's not the right word, but they were kind of excited to be able to share a couple other things, or it made the conversation much more uplifting. That would be the word. It
Huh.
became a more uplifting. So I would tell you the first time with each of them was a little bit of confusion, but then there was a bit of a lift that came out of it because the expectation didn't happen of she can be hanging up any second.
Right.
I'm sure it's probably a running joke with them too, you know did you get your 30-second conversation with daily conversation with mom? But yeah,
Right.
it was good. It
Yeah.
was good to hear, and the change up was good. And sometimes you don't even have to acknowledge something. It wasn't something that required an apology and overthinking, but sometimes you just have to do it, right? You
Right.
just have to try different things and be open-minded to different things. And I like what you just said. You just made me open-minded to something. I tend to, when something comes up, I tend to flip it. And Garrett always says you just flipped it and make somebody else think about what they're doing. I'm always flipping it so they can walk in my shoes, or you do the same thing, and just take it and don't always think you have to. And if flipping it isn't a defensiveness, for me, it's more of explaining or pointing out what they do the same thing, but that isn't the point. It doesn't
Right.
have to be a circle.
Right. Yes. You can take something and learn from it without projecting it back to others.
Right.
Yeah. So, what have you ever given advice that you don't take? Like,
Oh, I'm sure I do all the
I know
time.
I was gonna say, as I asked that, I was like, okay, we all do that. We've already acknowledged that. Do you have an example when you've done
Well,
it?
you know what would be really a really good example? And I actually think about this every time I give a workshop, because I'm walking them through their value proposition. Here's all the things to do, here's all the things not to do. And I would say it's a great reminder because I'm like, am I doing this? Like right now, did I do this yesterday? And I would tell you, yes, absolutely. I couldn't authentically give the speech, the workshop, if I wasn't living it. but maybe the afternoon before when I was prepping for the conference, I was in a hurry. Was I really embracing it like I should? So that would be a great example for me that it's good for me to get in the light and tell these things, because the takeaway usually when I go is, okay, are you doing this all the time? You're giving past stories, but yesterday, the week before, am I doing it?
So Sandy, that's so funny because that is exactly the example I had that I was like, oh, right off the top of my head, I know that I give productivity advice, during my keynote, and it's things that I apply probably 90% of the time, maybe a little bit more, but there are definitely times that I like just blow it off and I
Right.
don't do it. Yeah, and one of them is that I was thinking of is that, well, there were a couple that I thought of, but the Eisenhower matrix. And do you know the Eisenhower? Yeah, I'm sure
Oh,
you do. It's where it's
no, I
the,
don't.
no, you've probably seen it.
Do I call it something else? Is it what's
Probably.
important, the
Yes.
quadrants?
It's
Okay.
what's important and
Urgent,
what's
urgent, and
urgent
important. Okay.
and important. Yes,
Okay.
it's that.
Yes, definitely.
And so that quadrant that you're supposed to spend most of your time on is the important, not urgent. So it's the things that are your long-term goals that, there's no urgency to them, but they're important to you. So you want to be constantly working towards those. And those are typically the things that get dropped in most people's lives. So when I do my talk, I always talk about this quadrant two and how we should be intentionally spending our time in quadrant two so that we're making progress on all these things. And that's probably my biggest downfall, because most of the time I'm trying to do that, but a lot of times I need that sense of urgency to like push me to get something done. And so sometimes I will procrastinate by doing other things. And then I come up, I'm like, all right, now that's due. I need to push this out and get it done. So I am very guilty of that.
Don't you think it's being self-aware? We're not perfect, and
Yeah.
can you imagine giving advice and this happens, and people will give advice, or let's just go back to the keynote or the workshops, and you find out they do something completely opposite because, they get paid to give the advice, but there's a complete disconnect in how they live their lives. So, Solomon,
Yeah.
I would use his example. I mean, that's a pretty blatant example. Do not cheat on your wife, but it's not just one mistake, but having multiple instances is just a complete disregard, right? And so intentionality, not always having that right on mindset, that happens.
Yeah.
That's part of the grace we need to give ourselves and to others. But when it's a blatant misstatement, and I think that's why there's so many people that can have problems with people of power in politics or religion, because they're very vocal in their advice, right? In what they believe in and what they're telling other people to do. And so those ones that sway from it, it's so public, right? And it's so black and white on what they're doing. I don't think I do that. I think I really authentically live to what I believe in, what I say, the advice I give. Am I perfect? No. Am I anywhere close to perfect? No. There's some days I'm really bad, right? And then I have to say, get back on it. But that that complete magnet, difference of advice versus living, I know you don't do it and I don't do it. And probably most of the people in my circle don't do it because I can't, I can't be by the Solomons. That's not something that's in my value set that I could live with daily. And that's why I turn off the TV when it's issues on using the politics and the religion, because I got other things to focus on.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that most people who are living authentically and they're aligning their values with how they're approaching a lot of things, then they're not going to be in this position of giving advice that they wouldn't take. They're not going to spiel things that are just completely opposite of what they're doing. but we're not all perfect. Nobody's perfect. And there are times when we don't completely 100%. We got to forgive ourselves for that. One of the things I was thinking of, people who give advice who haven't been in your shoes. So I always struggle with that. Like if somebody asks me a question about productivity, like I've struggled through productivity challenges and stuff like that. So that's pretty straightforward. But if somebody asks me about relationship advice, like a divorce, going through a divorce and something like that, I wouldn't have the experience to give them, I think, solid advice. Okay. So I probably would shy away from giving them really like detailed advice. I would probably give them some broader relationship advice, maybe something that I'd experienced, but I'd be more careful. But I think about that with like priest giving marriage advice.
Mhm.
They, I respect priests. They've got a lot of wisdom, but not having been in that relationship where you're with somebody all the time and you're intertwining your finances, your children, like all of that stuff.
Previous relationships,
Right. Like there's all,
facts, it's there, right? It's a physical
yeah,
act. It's a emotional act, that's.
yeah. And how they can give advice without actually, because I feel like advice from that perspective is pretty theoretical. Like, here's what I think you should do. But
And one thing I know I've gotten way better on with age and with experience is if somebody asks my advice or brings something up that I'm perfectly fine saying, I can listen, I can, if you want to hear my opinion, but it's very limited in where it's
yeah,
coming from. Or if it's from a consulting standpoint, that's not my area. And that's okay, because I tell you what, when I was a young consultant professional, it used to be, fake it till you make it, right? That to say, everything, go ask for it, fake it, and don't show that vulnerability that you don't know something. And honestly, I got burned if I did show it. I remember, and I never really did like doing taxes, but I didn't memorize the whole tax code. And who in the world would expect somebody to memorize it? But nobody ever wanted to hear, let me research that and get back to you, because they expected me to know it all. And so there were different ways to phrase that, but in retrospect, was that so wrong to say, I don't know the answer right away, let me look into it? And again, it didn't happen all the time, but I clearly remember people saying, I need somebody who's more seasoned, who already knows this. And I don't know, maybe that was the reason I never really enjoyed law. I could never fake it till I made it. Yeah, and it was hard to give advice if I didn't feel confident in my answer. But then we did, we learned ways to say, let me get back to you on that. I need, you can say, I need to research further. I want to get a second opinion. And if somebody doesn't like that, then they don't like it.
right. And yeah, I would say that one of the things that I've heard is when hiring people, you should actually look for people who ask questions and know where to find the answer, not the people who think they know it all, which makes total sense. But a lot of times when we're in a situation like that, we want somebody with the answer. So it's kind of, it's
Did I
hard.
ever tell you? And it was just so funny because the look on their faces, this was an opinion about myself. When I won, when I was honored with being one of the 10 outstanding Omahans, you had to go through this interview process. And I went to this boardroom filled with, you know, people of power and significance, and that were choosing the 10 outstanding Omahans. And they asked me the question, and Garrido says, you do not follow the game when you're being interviewed. And they said, why do you think you're one of the top 10 in Omaha? And I said, well, I have no idea. I don't know who the other candidates are. They quite frankly, there's probably hundreds of people better than me. But I didn't give them the answer of here's all the reason, because I was supposed to articulate why I was the 10 best. And first of all, I'm like, I don't even know who I'm comparing to. I just can't answer that question. And I did get it, but I wasn't going to offer and it wasn't me being humble. I just thought it was kind of ludicrous to say, here's why I think I'm in the top 10 when I don't even know who I'm competing with. I can think of 10 wonderful people off the top of my head, right? It's like, do you want a list of who I think the top 10 are?
Right.
And then we can analyze together. I don't know, but it's even an opinion about yourself, right?
It is. And it's your ego. Like, how are you representing your ego with, hey, let me tell you why I'm top 10, or hey, this is why you need to listen to my advice because I'm this, you know?
Do you have anyone in your life, or has, we're not going to name names, that gives advice on absolutely everything, whether they know an answer or whether
Oh,
they are
yeah. They have an opinion and
on
they're going to tell
everything?
you what they think you need to do. Yes,
And
I
then
do have.
I find myself that I really watch how I word things, so I'm not opening the door to the advice. Because if there's even a small advice, and not just on me, the people around me, advice on everything.
Yeah.
And you would think they're doing that with everyone. They can't be getting positive feedback. Is that a place of insecurity? Where does that come from?
I don't know. That's a really good question. That would be
You think the social cues would say, wow, this isn't going over very well
right, exactly. I don't think people want my advice.
on everything. Or, wow, I'm getting shut down a lot, or people are changing the subject or walking away. But there are people out there that it's just they've got advice, opinion, and unsolicited.
Yes.
You can't even open the door.
Well, and to flip that, because because of my leadership in NAPO and stuff, I was interviewed a lot and seen as an expert, and people would ask me for advice of things that were silly to like give advice for. And more often than not, the reporters would walk away with, all right, well, that wasn't what I wanted. So I'll give you an example. One time I had a reporter ask, what is the one thing you would never do in the morning to set yourself up for a productive day? So it's like this, what's the thing you're never gonna do? And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, there's lots of things I would never do in the morning, but what is the thing I'm gonna put out there
Hey,
for people to read and think that this is the way you should be living? And so I was like, well, everybody's different on what makes them, successful and productive in the day. And what works for you may not work for me. And so that was kind of my answer. It was like,
yeah,
that's
somewhere I have a card that has the word ask hole on it. And that's the flip. That's the person that's always asking for advice but never follows it.
yeah,
And so it's like, oh my gosh, it's the flip. If you're gonna and I don't think you're obligated to follow the advice. When you ask for advice, it's up to the individual what you do with it. But if you're constantly going back to the well with the same problem, wanting to know what to do and make no action toward the change, you as the advice giver do feel like you're dealing with an asshole.
yeah, yes. Yeah. And to that point, media, they like to put out advice that, makes people think that they need to be doing things differently. And so you just have to filter that to make sure it applies to you.
In general, though, advice taking and advice giving when open is a great thing.
Yes.
But it's back to our examples. If you have to be self-aware that when giving advice, if you're not following it, it's not going to be very effective.
Right. And giving advice when people ask for advice, not when just because you have a thought and an opinion. All right. Well, this is good. This was great. I'm glad we got to learn about Solomon's paradox because I had never heard of it either. And I do think it's an interesting to be aware, just to be self-aware of what you're putting out there and making sure you're applying it to you.
I like it. I'm gonna apply it today, Amy.
I know. I'll try to.
We'll try.
I'll try.
We'll try. We're human.
Okay.
All
We'll
right,
try.
until next week.
All right. Thanks, Sandy.
Bye.